country? Anton? And my opponents?
Yep.
All right, let's begin. During the past 20 years, dozens of countries have concluded that the corporate income tax is one of the most economically destructive mechanisms for raising revenue because it destroys production. This quote from Barb Marshall, the president of Richmond Group Fund, demonstrates the negative team's philosophy and that the United States should do the same as dozens of other countries and abolish the corporate tax once and for all. With that said, I'm going to respond to the disadvantages I brought up in my speech. Disadvantage 1 of preventing economic growth, disadvantage 2 of keeping the businesses overseas, and then finally responding to one of their arguments on the counterclaim. My partner really responded to most of the others. Starting off with disadvantage 1, they had a couple responses. The first was that we're preventing economic growth and the price of products is high because of the high rate. My simple response is regardless of the rate. Regardless of the rate. They never actually read the evidence that says, quote, the reality is that corporations do not pay corporate income taxes. They simply add the cost of this government-imposed expense to the price of the product they produce and then collect this tax from the people on behalf of the government. This is specifically saying why the corporate tax itself is bad, not the tax rate. Sure, if you lower the tax rate, you might lower the price of the product a little bit, but you're never going to lower it to the extent it could be if you did not have a corporate tax in the first place. Again, it's the corporate tax itself that is actually artificially raising the price of the product, not necessarily the high rate, which means to their second response, they talked about the tax cut would reduce prices. The tax cut would reduce prices. To this I have two responses. My first is that of analysis versus evidence. Analysis versus evidence. We've read you specific pieces of evidence in today's debate round saying the only way to actually fully undo these disadvantages and not have these problems within the economy is to completely abolish the corporate tax once and for all. There was no counter evidence brought up by the affirmative team. It was simply their analysis versus our credited evidence. My second response is not full reduction. Not full reduction. Yes, even if they reduce the price of the corporate tax to 35% to 25%, then I suppose the price of the product may also take a 10% decrease. But the fact is, regardless, you are still paying the corporate tax through products that are higher prices than they should be if the corporate tax does not exist. Therefore, again, their plan still has this problem because they do not fully abolish. Their third and final response is that they increase wages. My response is only the counterplan helps wages. Only the counterplan helps wages. They never responded to the evidence we led from Luis Gomez in September 2011 that said, quote, what is really insidious about this corporate tax is that corporate taxes are paid by the consumer built into the cost of good or service. Corporate taxes are paid for people in the form of lower wages to American workers. Let me repeat that. Corporate taxes, not corporate tax rate, but corporate taxes are paid for and by people in the form of lower wages to American people. It's the corporate tax, not the rate, that is the root problem here. Don't simply reduce the problem, eliminate it completely. On disadvantage 2 of competitive rate, after disadvantage 1, they basically said, look, the counterplan is going to decrease wages and hurt the deficit. I believe my partner adequately responded to that in his last speech. We're actually going to have a net increase in revenue by $33 billion, and obviously increased wages as our evidence is pointed out. There again, it was analysis versus evidence. You're always going to be going with the more credible sources in the debate round. The evidence is on the negative team's side. With that said, let's move to disadvantage 2 of keeping businesses overseas. They had one response, and that was at a competitive rate. A competitive rate. To this, I have two responses. My first is that the affirmative is uncompetitive. The affirmative is uncompetitive. The affirmative team can never be competitive with other countries that have no corporate tax rate whatsoever when they impose a 25% corporate tax rate. Obviously, if you're a corporation, you're going to go where it's ever most beneficial and most of a tax haven for you. The affirmative team is not going to be competitive, which is into my second response. The counterplan creates competition. The counterplan creates ultimate competition. By actually being competitive at the level of competitiveness that other countries are playing at, the affirmative team or the counterplan would actually help to improve the U.S. economy by creating full competition with other countries. The counterplan is the only way to be completely competitive with countries like Estonia that have a 0% tax rate and with other countries that have a near 0% tax rate like Ireland, as the affirmative team mentioned. With that said, I'd like to read one more response to when they talked about the counterplan being topical. I'd simply like to read a piece of evidence. This is from Josh Meany and Kate Shuster, who wrote the book Art, Argument, and Advocacy. It's a mandatory reading for many college forensic leagues in 2002 when they say, quote, some people believe that counterplans have to be non-topical. They argue that to effectively challenge the topic, the opposition team can only defend non-topical action. We believe that this philosophy is fundamentally bankrupt. The plan is the focus of the debate. As long as the counterplan is counter to the plan, it is a legitimate subject for discussion. In a debate, the plan becomes the embodiment of the resolution. It is the living interpretation of the topic. Once the plan is the interpretation of the topic, any policy that's not the plan is automatically not the topic. Consider, you would never say that the disadvantage about the topic is illegitimate because it is about the topic. Yet people say this kind of thing about counterplans all the time. Let us emphasize again, the plan is the focus of the debate. It is said that topical counterplans are unfair because they force the proposition team to debate against the topic. That is untrue. Once the case for the topic has been made using the plan's advantages, anything that is counter to that case is not the topic and intrinsically counter to the topic. It is for that reason I would urge a negative ballot.